Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we are sifting through a really fascinating stack of source material. It all details what's being called one of the most significant strategic pivots in, decades. We're talking about U.S.-Mexico relations and, maybe most importantly, the long, long war against the powerful criminal cartels.
It's a massive break. You really can't overstate it. For years, you're right, for decades, the official line from Mexico, and especially under President Claudia Sheinbaum, was just a hard no. A resolute refusal of pretty much all outside help when it came to confronting these organizations head on.
It was an article of faith for them politically.
It absolutely was.
Exactly. So the core claim, and you see this running through every one of these sources, is that this refusal, this absolute red line, was finally and quite dramatically reversed.
Yeah.
The whole policy just changed. It's a huge shift. So our mission today isn't just to say, hey, it happened. It's to really unpack the mechanics of how it happened. We're going to focus on how three different things converged. Spiraling internal chaos inside Mexico, very targeted external pressure from the U.S., and maybe the most surprising part of all the ripple effects of U.S. domestic economic policy.
And setting the stage here is it's essential. You had that initial offer of military and logistical help. It was blunt, it was public, and Sheinbaum emphatically rejected it months ago. That's the baseline.
Right.
And for a very long time, the security establishment on both sides of the border looked at the cartels as, well, not as a problem you could solve. It was a crisis you had to manage. Contain, exactly. So this strategic reversal, if it actually holds, represents a huge conceptual shift. It's a move from management to the active pursuit of a solution. And that's really the gravity of the material we're getting into today.
It really feels like a moment of forced clarity. Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start with those internal dynamics. As we said, Mexico has lived with cartel violence for generations. It's a fact of life. And initially, President Sheinbaum, she held the line. She stuck to the status quo, which meant, keeping the problem internal, refusing any help that might look like a loss of sovereignty, and trying to handle it all with local forces that they've historically been pretty inadequate.
They've been overwhelmed for a long time. But the sources all point to one specific event. It wasn't just another tragedy in a long line of tragedies. This was different. This was the fatal mistake that really triggered the whole political collapse.
And that event was the assassination of Mayor Carlos Monzon.
Yes. And what made this one so different? The sources paint a picture of him as a pretty unique political figure. He was young, charismatic, and genuinely popular. But the crucial part is he didn't just give generic speeches against violence.
Right.
He was a vocal, persistent critic of the cartels, sure, but also of the government's perceived inaction, their complacency. To a lot of people, he kind of represented a clean break from that old, corrupted political guard.
And the way they killed him it was calculated, maximum terror. It was done, and the sources all say this, in broad daylight in front of witnesses. So this wasn't some hidden abduction or a midnight execution. This was a public spectacle.
It was a message, a definitive message sent by the cartels to anyone else who might be thinking about speaking out. They absolutely intended this to be the ultimate show of force. The goal was to breed public submission, fear.
But they completely misread the room. They miscalculated the political mood entirely.
They really did. Because mass violence, as you say, it often does lead to public submission. People get scared, they stay inside. But in Monzon's case, because he was such a potent symbol of hope and, clean politics, his death had the exact opposite effect.
It became a catalyst.
A huge one. The fear that had been simmering for decades, it turned into pure, unadulterated public rage. This one murder crystallized all that pent-up frustration. It was like a lightning rod for the whole country's discontent.
And that rage wasn't just directed at the criminals. It was laser-focused on the government. The chant that erupted almost immediately and spread like wildfire was, Carlos did not die, the government killed him. And we really need to clarify that accusation because it's not literal. They're not saying Sheinbaum pulled the trigger.
No, it's a profound political statement. It's about complicity. The cartels committed the act, sure, but the public outrage was rooted in this feeling that the government enabled it, that their choices led to this moment. The accusation came from this widespread belief that Sheinbaum's administration had prioritized political optics, stubbornly refusing outside help, constantly downplaying the scale of the threat, clinging to a failed status quo.
Overprotecting its own citizens.
Over the actual protection of its citizens. And her consistent refusal of that initial U.S. offer for joint action, well, in the public eye, that became the damning proof of institutional failure and, frankly, betrayal.
And that breakdown of faith, that sense of betrayal, it metastasized very, very quickly into physical chaos.
Hmm.
The sources paint a pretty harrowing picture of what happened in late 2025. We're talking Mexico City, the political and cultural heart of the nation, just
Hmm.
erupting. Thousands of citizens, and not just your typical activists. We're talking about everyday people descending on the Zocalo, on the National Palace.
And the sheer scale of it, of the confrontation, it just underscores the gravity of the crisis. The anger wasn't abstract. It was directed right at the leadership, based on this perception that the government was, at best, totally incompetent, and
And on it,
at worst, actively protecting the criminal networks that were terrorizing their daily lives. You saw protesters literally tearing down the heavy metal barriers that surround the presidential palace. Police lines were collapsing. The sources say over 100 police officers were injured as they were forced back into these defensive shield-holding formations. They were just overwhelmed by the sheer anger and desperation of the crowd.
It was a total breakdown, a complete erosion of the social contract.
Total chaos.
And what's so fascinating here, and this is what the U.S. strategy really leveraged, is that these weren't just, standard political protests about taxes or policy. This was about citizens truly believing that their leaders were in league with the criminals.
Mhm.
And when the public believes the government is complicit, political stability it evaporates instantly. That intense nationwide rage created a political vacuum. It was the perfect opening that the U.S. side had apparently been waiting for.
That's right. I mean, the U.S. strategy, which had long assumed that Mexico's refusal to really go after the cartels would eventually lead to this kind of domestic destabilization,
Well,
they were watching this unfold in real time. They were primed for the exact moment when Sheinbaum's rejectionist stance became, well, politically suicidal for her and her administration. Monzon's murder wasn't the cause of the entire crisis, but it was absolutely the final critical trigger.
so we have the streets on fire, the public is essentially chanting treason, and now the political system itself starts to fracture. People are openly breaking with the administration's long-standing policy. This is where the narrative shifts from street protests to, really, an institutional collapse.
This is the moment when high-level Mexican officials started doing what was previously unthinkable. They started publicly defecting from the official government line. And the sources all focus on one statement in particular that just dominated the news cycle. It was Senator Lily Tellez, a very prominent figure. She went on national television and she stated, plainly and unequivocally, Mexico is a narco state.
And that's not hyperbole. That is a specific political charge with monumental weight behind it.
Oh, it's an earthquake. And her claims went way beyond just typical corruption allegations. She specifically accused the ruling party, Morena, of being systematically financed by cartel money. She alleged that cartel influence had, metastasized deep into government institutions. She was basically arguing that the cartels were the government's silent partners.
Wow. The scale of that alleged penetration is just staggering to think about.
It is, and it was a direct political assault on the very foundation of the administration. But the second part of her statement was just as crucial because it directly validated the U.S. position. She said, and I'm quoting here, "The Mexican people want U.S. support. The only ones who don't are the politicians who benefit from keeping the cartel strong."
And that just resonated. You can imagine how that landed with the public.
It resonated powerfully across the whole country. It was immediately amplified by the protesters, by social media, by opposition media. It completely transformed the debate. It went from being a matter of security policy to this explosive national discussion about sovereignty versus treason.
And that level of internal political fracture was exactly what the U.S. diplomatic strategy was built for. So while Mexico is consumed by this chaos and these internal accusations, the U.S. State Department, which the sources say was being very actively managed by Secretary Marco Rubio, had been engaged for months in this quiet groundwork.
Right. They weren't just sitting back and waiting for a collapse to happen. The State Department had been systematically building relationships, talking to Mexican civic leaders, business groups, governors, certain mayors, basically anyone who was already deeply critical of Sheinbaum's refusal of U.S. help.
So the goal was sophisticated. It wasn't about planning a coup or an invasion.
No, not at all. The goal was to build a coalition of domestic voices so that when the crisis peaked, that coalition would generate such overwhelming internal pressure that it would become politically impossible for Sheinbaum to keep saying no.
So they were using Mexican voices to advocate for U.S. cooperation. The idea was to create a coalition that can prove the request for help was coming from within Mexico, not being imposed from outside.
Precisely.
Okay, so now you layer on top of this internal chaos and the quiet diplomatic work, a seemingly disconnected external move, the Venezuela factor. The sources describe this as a very strategic, indirect application of military leverage.
It was a very deliberate escalation, and it was designed to send a powerful geopolitical signal. The U.S. administration started hinting, publicly and repeatedly, at the potential for direct military action against Venezuela's Maduro regime. And, you ask, why Venezuela?
Right. What's the connection?
Well, the sources identify it as a critical regional hub for organized crime, for major drug trafficking operations, for massive money laundering. And crucially, it's also explicitly aligned with adversarial powers. We're talking Russia, China, and Iran.
And this wasn't just talk, was it? The threats were backed up by a very tangible, very massive show of
Oh,
force.
absolutely. We saw the rapid repositioning of significant U.S. naval assets. I mean, everything.
Mhm.
Aircraft carriers, destroyer groups, amphibious assault groups all moved into the Caribbean Sea.
The message was pretty clear.
It was a message that completely bypassed normal diplomatic channels. It basically stated, the United States is serious about regional stability, and we are prepared to reshape the security landscape of this hemisphere. And we will do it with or without your cooperation. So President Sheinbaum is suddenly facing this perfect storm, the collapse of her internal political authority because of the riots and the Monzon fallout, and at the same time, the highly visible reality of major U.S. military posturing right on her doorstep. It demonstrated both the capacity and the will to act.
And this cocktail of internal rage, diplomatic fracturing, and military pressure, it leads directly to Scheinbaum's critical miscalculation, a huge one. Instead of acknowledging the legitimate public anger with the escalating crisis, she tried to use a classic authoritarian playbook. She tried to deflect.
She did. She attempted to frame the entire crisis as a conspiracy. She started claiming that foreign actors, and everyone knew she meant the United States, were manufacturing and funding the protests to undermine her administration.
Blaming outsiders for internal problems, a desperate move.
It's often a desperate last move, and the sources all emphasize that it backfired. I mean, spectacularly. And it backfired precisely because of the deep personal pain that citizens were feeling.
Of course.
When a leader tells citizens who have just watched a charismatic mayor publicly executed, who are victims of relentless extortion, who have lost family members to cartel violence, when you tell those people that their rage is just manufactured by foreigners, it's not just condescending. It's seen as an act of callous dismissal.
The fallout was immediate.
Absolutely. This tactic just intensified the protests. It caused her approval ratings to crater into historically low territory, and it prompted her political allies to start sensing that her position was toxic. They started fleeing the sinking ship. By dismissing the legitimate, visceral outrage of her own people, she lost the moral high ground completely, and that political fracture just deepened, setting the stage for the final and maybe most unexpected pressure point, the economic squeeze.
And here's where the narrative takes a really, really interesting turn. Because the pressure that was applied wasn't just diplomatic or military, it was economic. And it started not from some direct foreign policy intervention, but from U.S. domestic policy. We are talking about the unprecedented scale of deportations and departures from the U.S. and their completely unintended effect on the cartels.
This is such a critical factor, and it's detailed heavily in the source material. It's the link that often gets missed in just a straight security analysis. You have to look at the sheer magnitude of the human outflow that happened in that 10-month period they cite. It represents a massive and very rapid demographic reversal.
Let's just break down those figures because the numbers are, they're staggering. The sources highlight two main categories of people leaving the U.S. First, over 2 million people who had entered illegally reportedly chose to leave voluntarily. They were using these new programs designed to facilitate an orderly departure, which suggests a big shift in incentives.
A huge shift. And then on top of that, you have another 600,000 to 700,000 people who are formally detained and deported through very aggressive enforcement operations.
So you combine those two figures. You're talking close to 3 million people leaving the United States in less than a year.
Less than a year. And to give you some context for that number, that is like emptying the entire state of Iowa, or nearly depopulating the city of Chicago. In under 12 months, this isn't a slow trickle. This is a colossal, rapid, and very observable demographic shift.
So the question then becomes, what does that kind of massive, sudden outflow do to a complex modern economy like the U.S.? And the sources cite this theory that connects this reversal directly to the cooling of U.S. inflation. It basically posits that this outflow dramatically eased demand pressure on critical resources that had been severely strained by the previous years of high migration.
And this is the economic key. When a population base grows dramatically and quickly, which it did in the years before this period, without a corresponding increase in what economists call inelastic goods, you generate inflation. It's almost guaranteed.
Inelastic goods being things like housing, right? Things you can't just create more of overnight.
Exactly. Existing housing stock, critical public infrastructure capacity, roads, sewage systems, energy grids, and even specific localized labor markets. When millions of new people enter the economy without immediately increasing the supply of houses, they compete fiercely for what's already there. And that pushes prices up much, much faster than wages or production can react.
So it follows that when you reverse that flow, when nearly 3 million people leave in a short span, you get the opposite economic effect. And the result, according to the sources, was tangible and rapid.
It was. The pressure on those inelastic resources is relieved almost immediately. The sources point to specific, very striking economic benefits. Housing markets, which had been just boiling hot, they loosened up. Rental prices stabilized, or in many key markets, actually started to drop noticeably. Inflation began cooling dramatically across the board. We also saw immediate drops in energy and gasoline prices, which then feeds through the whole supply chain and impacts everyone's cost of living.
And the most important metric for the average person, their purchasing power, that started to recover significantly. The analysis cited in these sources, particularly from Kevin Hassett on the Trump Economic Council, estimated an increase of well over $1,000 per household in recovered purchasing power. And the long-term forecasts were suggesting even more gains.
Yeah, let's elaborate on Hassett's analysis because he provides the mechanism for why this worked. He specifically linked that preceding inflation spike, which it hit close to a 10% peak and averaged around 5% over the 4 years before. He linked it to the sheer velocity and volume of people entering the economy. Without the necessary concurrent expansion in housing and goods production and infrastructure, he basically argued that previous policy choices related to population flow were inadvertently driving up the cost of living for established citizens.
So, simple formula. High migration plus a stagnant housing supply equals rent and housing price spikes. And we saw Vice President J.D. Vance emphasizing the social side of this too, particularly for younger people. He argued that the previous migration waves had just intensely exacerbated competition for starter homes, for apartments, for limited urban resources,
Yeah.
making it financially impossible for young couples and new families to even get started.
Right, and according to Vance, the administration was attacking this problem from both sides. On one hand, aggressively reducing that demand pressure through the massive outflow of people, but at the same time, pursuing deregulation and incentivizing new construction to increase the supply of new housing, factories, and energy infrastructure. The combination of those two things was cited as the reason why the housing market, a key inflation driver, finally started to become more accessible for more people.
But here's the truly critical link, the geopolitical one that connects U.S. domestic success all the way back to the crisis in Mexico. And that is the resulting economic collapse of the cartels themselves.
That is the ultimate strategic domino. The very same cartel-controlled smuggling networks that rely on moving people north, their entire infrastructure of human trafficking, suddenly saw their primary massive revenue model just dry up almost overnight as that outflow from the U.S. accelerated.
So hang on, why was human trafficking so critical? I think most people assume it's all about drugs.
Well, drug trafficking is their historical backbone, of course, but human trafficking became this massive, immediate, high-volume cash flow. Think about it. Drugs require complex processing, distribution networks, large upfront investments. Human trafficking, especially during periods of high demand to get into the U.S., is a massive volume business with incredibly low overhead. The cartels just control the territory, they charge exorbitant fees to pass through, and they receive cash transfers instantly. When 3 million people either stopped making that journey or were leaving, that ready cash flow, we're talking hundreds of millions, if not billions of dollars, it just evaporated.
And the collapse of their illicit income, that generated the ultimate political leverage against the Sheinbaum administration. Because ordinary Mexicans who had been victimized by these same smuggling networks, whose communities were being hollowed out by this dangerous migration, they started asking a pivotal question. You see it in the source material. If the U.S. president can fix this problem, if he can reduce the chaos and stop the flow of money, why can't our own government?
And that is the strategic masterpiece that the source identifies. The U.S. approach worked, and its success was felt, even if indirectly, by the Mexican people. They saw their local cartels losing power. They saw their fellow citizens less incentivized to risk their lives migrating north.
And this made that original Trump offer, which had been dismissed as this imperialist threat, suddenly look like the only pragmatic, realistic, and successful solution to their own internal security crisis.
That economic pressure became the final, undeniable political force pushing the administration toward accepting help.
So the pressure was now just. It was overwhelming, and it was coming from everywhere. You had the public fury over Monzon, you had the political defections from major figures like Senator Tellez, you had the credible military posturing near Venezuela, and now this undeniable economic disruption that was crippling the cartel's main income stream. Scheinbaum's political position had become utterly untenable.
Resistance crumbled. It crumbled because of political exhaustion, not because of a military defeat. Her approval ratings were at rock bottom, the Monzon protests were nonstop, and her attempt to dismiss the whole thing as a U.S. conspiracy had completely and totally failed. Her options just narrowed down to zero.
And the sources are very clear that the shift happened first in private signals, behind the scenes. Mexican senators, governors, powerful mayors, the people who actually have to face the voters and the cartels on the ground, they began secretly reaching out to U.S. officials. They were testing the waters, moving away from Scheinbaum's hardline rejectionist position and looking for a way to structure cooperation.
And the central concern in all those private inquiries was always the same: preserving national sovereignty. So the key negotiation framework revolved around avoiding a full U.S. deployment. No one wanted an occupation. The questions were all about defining the nature of the help. Could it be limited to intelligence sharing, logistical support, training and equipping specific joint operations teams? They were searching for a path that allowed them to accept the help they desperately needed without it looking like a national humiliation.
And the consistent answer coming back from the U.S. side, according to these documents, was one of genuine flexibility. They repeatedly stressed that they were not interested in a permanent occupation. They were interested in destroying the cartels. But, and this is a key point, the sources note the commitment had to be real. It had to be focused on genuine, measurable joint efforts to dismantle the cartel infrastructure, their financing, their leadership, not just a symbolic handshake for the cameras.
And this brings us right to the ultimate definition of the strategic win, according to this source material. The U.S. leadership, by acting strategically, didn't need to resort to an invasion or unilateral strikes. The goal was achieved entirely by skillfully creating a political environment where the internal cost for Scheinbaum to keep saying no to U.S. help became exponentially higher than the political cost of finally saying yes.
It's textbook leverage. He successfully leveraged Mexico's own internal dynamics, the chaos, the moral outrage, the fracturing political authority, and then he compounded that with his own domestic policy successes. Primarily the falling inflation and the record deportations, which provided this undeniable, tangible proof that his approach worked where hers had so spectacularly failed.
It was a strategic realignment achieved by setting the perfect conditions, and for decades the cartels were seen as this unmanageable security crisis. Now, as we look ahead, the entire political landscape is fundamentally altered. Mexico is no longer refusing help, it is demanding the means to implement effective joint action.
And the sources all outline the inevitable implications going forward, what this new normal is going to look like. Public opinion in Mexico is now overwhelmingly in favor of aggressive, coordinated joint action against the cartels. And that makes it extremely difficult for the Scheinbaum administration, even if they wanted to backtrack on this new agreement.
We should now expect to see highly coordinated operations. We're talking about deep intelligence sharing, logistical support for Mexican military operations, and the formation of integrated joint task forces that are specifically targeting cartel financing networks, their weapon flows, and their high-level leadership. This level of pressure on their supply chains and their banking assets is something they've never faced before. It's truly unprecedented.
So the ultimate implication here is that the Western Hemisphere is undergoing a profound security shift. The U.S. is taking a much more assertive and, it seems, conditions-based role in shaping regional security and stability. And the sources are clear. The victory was strategic and economic. It achieved through leverage what a conventional military confrontation might never have secured.
And the core conclusion that these analysts draw is that the win was achieved by meticulously setting the conditions, setting them so that, and this is the key phrase, the opponent has no good options left except the one you want them to choose. That really defines the entire sequence of events we've talked about, from Monzon's murder all the way to the policy reversal.
This has been a truly comprehensive deep dive. I mean, the complexity of the strategic pivot is incredible. We've traced this whole chain of events, how the brutal assassination of a single symbolic mayor, Carlos Monzon, ignited this uncontrollable public fury, how U.S. economic ripple effects, driven by that massive, rapid demographic outflow, crippled the cartel's cash flow, and how the strategic military posturing near Venezuela all contributed to one complex, interdependent outcome. Mexico finally, officially agreeing to aggressive joint cooperation.
And the source material argues very strongly that a permanent break in the cartel's decades-long hold on power is now, for the first time, actually achievable. The convergence of a fractured Mexican political class, genuine public support for action, and the fundamental collapse of the cartel's primary revenue stream, that human trafficking business, has created a genuinely fragile, but also a profoundly hopeful security window for all of North America.
And that leads us to our final provocative thought for you to consider as you wrap up this deep dive. We've established how internal Mexican pressure was expertly matched with U.S. economic success to create this irresistible political leverage. But criminal syndicates are, by their very nature, adaptive entities.
Yeah.
So consider what mechanism, if any, the cartels themselves might employ now. Maybe extreme, targeted violence against political figures or large-scale efforts to flood the U.S. with new threats.
Yeah.
What do they do to try and destabilize this new era of joint cooperation now that their primary revenue source and their traditional safe harbor have both been fundamentally challenged? What is the counter-move to a unified North American security response?
Indeed. Understanding their potential response is going to be crucial to maintaining the strategic advantage.
Thank you for joining us on the Deep Dive.
See you next time.